Now let's take a look at some very simple empirics. This is a graph of the number of armed conflicts, the green bars, and then deviations from the global mean temperature. That's the blue line. And if I'd been a neo-Malthusian talking about this 20 years ago, I could have said, well, both things are going up. Then if you look at the more recent 20 years, of course, they go off in different directions. What can we learn from this? Absolutely nothing. But unfortunately, some of the climate change and security, some of the climate change debate generally tends to assume this form: two things are going up, there must be a relationship. But it's of course not that simple. So instead, let's look at some possible pathways connecting climate change and conflict. And I think the most common scenario is the one that was hinted at, for instance, by both by President Obama and by the Nobel Peace Prize Committee. Sea level rise leads to migration, and this leads to conflict in the host areas which have to receive the migrants. And secondly, an increase in drought, flooding, and hurricanes may also lead to migration and into the first causal chain, but it could also lead to resource competition at home if people don't migrate away, and to local conflicts. So you could have conflict either where the problem occurs or where people migrate to. Another possibility is that drought, flooding, and hurricanes, if they occur in great numbers, might lower the state capacity. I guess the Haiti is a good example if the presidential palace collapses under an earthquake. But of course, state capacity was probably pretty low in Haiti before that. And this could lead to greater rebel opportunity. Urbanization could lead to social unrest, riots, and criminality. That's another possible causal chain here. Now, however, there are many counter-arguments to the conflict scenarios. First of all, a link between, which is drawn frequently by neo-Malthusians, between scarcity and conflict is only found in selected case studies, and statistical comparative analysis have not converged on any kind of robust relationship between scarcity of resources and armed conflict. And if we are to predict new conflicts in new places, we really are dependent on general relationships and not just case studies for selected countries. Now, regarding the migration to conflict link, there is some evidence that countries with high numbers of refugees tend to have more conflict. But it seems likely, although this hasn't been conclusively studied, it seems likely that a lot of this conflict that results from refugees is in a sense imported conflict, because the refugees are refugees from conflict, and they take the conflict organization, the weapons, the attitudes, etc., with them into the new location. Economic migrants, environmental migrants, might have a very different attitude and not result to conflict to the same degree. But these things have not been properly separated in these studies yet. Now, there are some analysis of disasters and conflict, and they suggest a connection, but it's mostly for geological disasters, which are not, of course, climate related. And there are also significant exceptions, such as the Archer conflict, which, rather than being worsened by the tsunami, seems to have been stimulated the settlement. The whole water literature has moved from water wars to water cooperation. 15 years ago, there was a lot of people talking about water wars. Now, the emphasis is much more on how can we solve water problems by cooperating. Finally, climate change is generally a slow process, and this is something that also points to the possibility of adaptation rather than fighting over scarcity. But of course, in many cases, we don't know how slow. In the case of the Himalayan glaciers, it's been suggested that the 35 years total meltdown was a mistake for 335 years. I mean, I'm not an expert on glaciers, so I don't want to pronounce on this, but the point is that if it's 335 years, then of course we have much more time to adapt, and so many other things will be happening in the meantime, that it's not a good basis for saying that this will lead to a dramatic conflict. There's a recent study that got a lot of attention because it was published just before Copenhagen. This is the article, Burke, Miguel, and others. This is a serious article arguing that, it is a serious peer-reviewed piece of work arguing that higher temperature leads to more conflict in sub-Saharan Africa. But of course it's just one study and the results probably not terribly robust. My colleague Halvard Buhaug has looked at the time series they use, which is relatively short. If you just add the years, and you can see that there's a seeming relationship over time here between conflict, which is the red line, and temperature, which is the blue line. But if you add a few more years, you can see they go off in different directions. And there are a number of other things too, which make these results relatively non-robust. Of course, this is not a climate change conspiracy, it's not cheating, but it's a normal part of scientific process. If somebody publishes something, they release their data, other people find different results, and it takes a while before enough studies accumulate so that you can actually say that, okay, this points in the direction of something which could be a consensual finding. What are the priorities? I think we need to disaggregate the climate conflict debate, look at specific causal patterns, causal chains. We need to couple the models of climate change to models of conflict, and we're trying to work with some meteorologists to do that. We need better data on violence, not just state-based violence, but also one-sided violence and non-state violence, communal conflicts, which could possibly be more related to climate change. We need to collect geo-reference data to look not just at conflict by nation, but by smaller regions. We need to look at interactions between climate change and political and economic factors. We need to integrate the consequences of climate change with other economic and social changes. If hundreds of millions of people are going to move to the cities as part of globalization and urbanization processes in the next 30 to 40 years, then of course 150 million climate refugees may be sucked up into that process and not be as much of a problem as if these other changes were not going on. And of course we need to focus on the most important consequences. So, conclusions, climate change is a major challenge. It is a security issue. There's little evidence to date that armed conflict is an important consequence. We need more research on climate change and conflict, and the 5th assessment report of the IPCC ought to take this issue more seriously, or alternatively simply say, not our business.